Hi, and welcome to session 3 of the International Virtual Symposium on Digitization and Democracy. The topic of our panel discussion today is New Directions, Potentials for Enhancing Democracy. So in a way, we're the optimist panel in this series, and we will let you, dear virtual participants, be the jury whether we will convince you about our collective ability to strengthen democracy in the digital age at a time where admittedly most of us are largely concerned about the negative impacts of big technology on society. My name is Urs Gasser. I'm the outgoing executive director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and I will soon be joining the Technical University of Munich as a professor. It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel with 3 esteemed experts and wonderful colleagues from different disciplines and different regions. I'd like to introduce them briefly, as I'm also asking them to join me on this virtual stage by turning on their videos. So welcome, colleagues. So first, Anat Ben David is a professor in the Department of Sociology, Political Science and Communication at the Open University of Israel. She's also a co-founder of the Open Media and Information Lab, and just briefly before we met, introduced herself as a lab rat. I like that a lot. Anat's research focuses on the geopolitics and epistemology of online media. She has done a lot of work and research around web history, web archive issues, and across her portfolio, she's developing and applying digital and computational methods for open source social web research. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Anat. Warm welcome. I'm also very pleased to introduce another wonderful colleague, Andreas Hepp, who's a professor of media and communications and the head of the Center for Media, Communication and Information Research at the University of Bremen in Germany. Andreas was a visiting researcher and professor at various institutions, including LSE, Sciences Po, Stanford, and others. He's the author of many influential books. I just point out his latest one, Deep Mediatization. I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book. And Andreas was also involved in the recent Leopoldina statement on digitalization and democracy, and I'm sure we'll return to that topic shortly. It's great to have you, Andreas. Last but not least, my dear US colleague, Frank Pasquale. He's a leading expert on the law of AI, algorithms and robotics, and many more things. Frank is a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School and has multiple academic affiliations, including Yale's ISP. He's also a member of the American Law Institute. And of course, many know Frank from his book, The Black Box Society, which is a true landmark study on the law and political economy of information. And also his latest book, New Laws of Robotics, is a total must read. So here we go. You have already a few books that are very much recommended. Welcome, Frank. It's fantastic to have you here as well. So before we jump right into it, I thought I would share a little bit the game plan for this session. So the idea is that each panelist will share a few opening reflections prompted by a question that I will ask to you. I may then ask, after this first set of comments, a few cross-sectional questions to get us more into conversation mode. And then we'll open up quite quickly to Q&A. So I would like to ask our virtual participants to share your comments and your questions through the Q&A function tool that you have at the bottom of your screens. The questions will then be reviewed, synthesized, and sent to me by our colleagues in the director's room. And I will try my best to put them into the flow of our conversation. So I hope this sounds like a feasible game plan for today. Yeah, let's get started. So Anat, if I may share a first question with you. And you know, I was wondering whether you could start us off by sharing maybe a bit of a contextual snapshot as to what extent democratic participation in Israel has already become digital, and what some of the implications are that you're worried about, but also maybe what some pathways forward may look like, given the topic of our panel, right? Where yes, there are lots of problems, but we hope we can also come up with if not solutions, at least approaches for a better future. So if I may, to turn it over to you to set the stage, and then we go from there. Thank you again for joining, Anat. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. So my contribution will have two parts. In the first part, I'll use Israel as a test case for questioning the assumption that political participation is a desired outcome of the coupling of digitization and democracy under all circumstances. In the second part, I'll discuss problems related to the resources required for maintaining a healthy digital democracy. Many view Israel as a sandbox for socio-technical innovation. The COVID-19 vaccination deal with Pfizer is an example to that. Israel was the first country to vaccinate its adult population in exchange for its rich population health data accumulated for years. However advantageous this deal might have been for advancing Israel's immunity, the trading of the entire population's health data for vaccines could have never been signed in any other Western democracy with updated data protection laws, such as Germany. Israel's privacy protection law was passed in 1981. The elections law, the main legislation regulating campaigns advertising in Israel, was passed in 1959, long before the rise of digital technologies. While new initiatives push for regulatory frameworks that advance digital innovation and governance, the laws that ensure that digital innovation is restrained in ways that protect civil liberties have been neglected, if not deliberately ignored. This loophole has benefited two local industries: the cyber industry, building on military intelligence technologies and methods, and the ad tech industry, building on the principles of surveillance capitalism. While inherently digital, these technologies are not designed for political participation. Their subjects are not citizens, but people with limited rights, terrorists, or simply customers amenable for convincing and manipulation. In the past years, the technologies and logic of the cyber and ad tech industries in Israel have been imported into the very heart of the country's electoral system. The 2 years of political turmoil and 4 consecutive election rounds increased political parties' appetite for using digital technologies for political gains and gave rise to rapid technological innovation in the field of digital campaigning and voter management. The logic of these technologies dictates that the effectiveness is measured in the ability to close in on a suspect, predict future actions, and maximize the return on investment. When imported into the political sphere, then the return on investment can be potentially understood in terms of increased participation, but at the same time, it reduces citizens' agency. As one election round followed another, Israel's political parties became disillusioned with the promise of social media for maximizing voter mobilization and developed independent voter tracking applications. Although political parties have legal access to the voter registry during electoral campaigns, these apps have unprecedentedly granted access to the voter registry to the general public and encourage supporters to assist the party's electoral success by providing information about the political views of their peers. On election day, users received real-time updates on the voting status of their friends, all without their knowledge or consent. The architecture of these apps created new inequalities between parties that had resources to develop them and those who did not, between users who spy on their peers and those subject to invisible surveillance. This scenario would be imaginary in countries such as Germany. However, the Israeli General Election Committee and Supreme Court did not find that these apps were in violation of Israel's existing privacy protection or election laws. In judicial proceedings, the developers of these apps argued that they are democratizing the electoral process by allowing political parties to reach their electorate, or by using the wisdom of the crowd, as they call it, to achieve this goal. But the social implications of this achieved effectiveness are countering the very logic of democratic participation. It may increase participation, but undermine civil liberties. The success of these apps in the third elections increased the number of political parties who use these technologies in the fourth round. Given the competitive advantage, it is unlikely that political parties will be interested in pursuing the long overdue update to Israel's privacy protection law. In the meantime, the prevalence of these apps cultivates a political culture that normalizes social coercion and surveillance as desired forms of political participation. The history of the web has taught us that the early marriage between the ethos of democratization and digitization has quickly soured. A parallel history of digitization in authoritarian regimes has taught us that without restraints, digital technologies work best for authoritarian purposes. Looking ahead, perhaps what Israel needs is not so much digitization, but restraint, or better yet, a fundamental return to the drawing board, shifting focus from digitization as innovation to a deep unpacking of the implication of digitization on human rights in the local context. This difficult task not only relates to regulation and policy, but also to efforts that should be put in reshaping its political culture and norms. The second part of my contribution relates to the precautions that are needed to ensure effective digital resources in a democracy. Answers to this question pertain to both Israel as well as globally. The ability to exchange ideas based on facts are the foundations of any liberal democracy. The problem with digital resources is twofold. Digital web resources are fragile and prone to disappear, a phenomenon also known as link rot or web decay. Platform data, on the other hand, is accumulated forever, but not always made public. The rise of social media platforms has resulted in an epistemic paradox whereby more data does not equal more truth. While the open web, or what's left of it, is prone to link rot, platforms have translated their business models into digital infrastructures that separate data from metadata and content from facts. They did not only become the arbiters of truth, as others call it, but also the ultimate archons, holders of humanities' private and public records. Platforms determine what can and cannot be made visible for public scrutiny. Trump's suspended account is an example to that, as even the National Archives, who are the legal entity responsible for preserving the presidential libraries, did not have Twitter's permission to lend access to Trump's legacy account. Equally disturbing is the fact that the difficulties in studying mis and disinformation on social media do not rise from the quantity of available data, but from their epistemic quality. The actions that take place at the back end of platforms are hidden from public oversight and debate. This relates both to the identity of account holders, but also to the content moderation decisions and policy. Thus, the digital public sphere is saturated with evidence-less data. Data that are in the public domain are prone to disappear. Other data that used to be public are now platform-owned, but lack effective public forensic tools for ensuring that facts are debated rationally. Ways for addressing these problems include regulation on platform transparency, not necessarily on content moderation, the opening of platforms for external research and oversight, the building of public tools for media critique, and the building of new distributed infrastructures for archiving public digital records. Going back to my first point, the idea here is not so much to build paternalistic tools and regulation that will discern fact from fallacy, but rather to think about tools that respect citizens' agency and self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anat, for setting the stage so beautifully, even in a sobering way, I would say. I think we have all the core themes already on the table. You spoke about data, you pointed out the role of platforms, the issue of surveillance, and in your last comment, I think also highlighting the importance of that this is an ecosystem challenge that various stakeholders have to work together, and we need to use all the tools in our toolkit if we want to make progress and create and shape a better future together. I'm sure we'll return to many of these issues in the following comments and then also in our conversation. If I may, Andreas, I'd like to pick up on one of the themes that Anat introduced as well, and that's the notion of political participation. Now, I know you have done a lot of work on participation in the pre-digital context, but also now, of course, in the specific context of this conversation. I mentioned you were among the working group members working on this Leopoldina report, which has a chapter actually on a section on participation. And so I was wondering whether you land in your research and in your observations on this question, what digital technologies enable us to do in terms of participation, where some of the remaining barriers are, and where we go from here. So over to you, Andreas.
Well, thanks a lot also for highlighting to this report. I think, especially when we're talking about participation, it's as an entry point important to have a long-term view. So in the beginning, we had these really utopian hopes when it came to the internet and digital infrastructure, what it might mean for participation in the US, but also in Germany and other European countries, it was the case. And I think now we are in a contrary phase. It's a different kind of wave. And it's exactly the opposite. So we have a pure emphasis on hate speech, of problems of data, and so on and so on and so on. And I think especially if you're at the peak of such a wave, of such a hype, it is important to be careful not to emphasize only the one side. So I would say when it comes to digital platforms, digital technologies, we should have in mind that they are a risk in particular moments, but they still open up chances for participation. And especially when it comes to data and datafication, we have new forms of participation which are data related. So also, I think we have to have in mind that many forms of participation is what we have called tiny forms of participation. So it's really quite little activities, a comment, highlighting this, doing this or that on a platform. It's only a few cases that the people become active in the sense of producing own videos. And I also would consider this as normal because all our time resources are limited. This is the case for everybody. But nevertheless, I would say especially these tiny forms of participation offer new chances when it comes to data. And I just want to tell one story about this to give you an example on that. And this is a story, it is a bit more than 1 year ago, a German NGO, you might call it NGO or civil society organization, Algorithm Watch. They started a campaign on data donation. So you could offer your own data on your finances in an anonymous way. And the idea was to reconstruct by this data information the algorithm based on which the credit score of one of the German institutions which calculates credit scores is calculated. So what you have by this is on the one hand that various tiny forms of participation offer, when they come together with an NGO or an institution like this, a new form of critique within society. So in the end, it was a press coverage about this Algorithm Watch campaign. Of course, not everything in the algorithm could be reconstructed, but nevertheless, the topic that credit scores are built, and that these credit scores are built in an automated way and have something to do with the ability to act in individual life, became a public issue, became discussed, and even came into the so-called legacy media, so the traditional media. And this is only one tiny example which shows what I would call the chances of new forms of participation. And there I would see the possibilities of a media environment as we have it today. But of course, the chances do not develop just out of the blue. taking this example of Algorithm Watch, you realize that we of course need strong NGOs, strong civil society organizations to support such tiny forms of participation. You also realize that we need a different kind of acting with data than we have it now. So nowadays, everybody is more or less used the way the data is something of surveillance capitalism, of data colonialism. So it's just the companies which take the data into their realm. What I think what is needed is a project kind of campaign that data could also be used in a different way, that there are emancipative dimensions of data and that we can make something participatory out of it. So this is what I would say are the chances we have, even in these times of deep mediatization and datafication. And I think it is a task for politics to support developments into that direction, because this can be something which can be positioned against the big tech organizations we are all confronted with.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andreas, for also taking us a step towards the more optimistic future, I guess. I think there is already a common theme emerging between Anat's description and your description, which is to say, you know, contrary to what some of us believed maybe 15 years ago at this moment of great enthusiasm, as you pointed out, Andreas, where we thought, okay, now we have finally this robust marketplace of ideas, which was mentioned already in the opening session of this virtual symposium, where, you know, if you have enough speakers, beautiful things will happen and the truth will prevail and the ideas will compete on this marketplace, and that's the ideal model for democracy. There was this moment of hope, right? And I think fast forward, what we've learned the hard way, arguably, is no, wait, this much depends on some sort of the ecology and the institutional frameworks we have in place. And it's not just happening organically. We have to curate, we have to build towards such an ideal information ecosystem, whether it's through law, and Anat mentioned the role of regulation or the lack thereof in her story. You pointed out like policy and political actions that we may take to create a more robust information ecosystem and support initiatives like the example you just provided. And I think, Frank, that's also very much what you have been thinking about very deeply in your work, perhaps with a slight emphasis on what law can contribute and what legal institutions can contribute at a critical moment in time where platforms in particular, as we've already discussed, have taken center stage in our discussions, where we see new tensions emerging from what you called automated public sphere when it comes to freedom and control. And I was wondering whether you could share your reflections, both again, in the same spirit, on some of the really pressing problems in front of us, maybe specifically also in the US context, but even more so, what are some of these tools maybe also offered by law and policy that we could deploy to create a better future? So Frank, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Urs, and it's a real honor and pleasure to follow up such compelling earlier contributions to the discussion. And, you know, I think that this idea, just to build on your idea of a common theme and that of constructing an ecology for participation, is something I'll take a little bit, I'll build on, in the sense that I wanted to speak today about what some people are seeing as an emerging tension between common carriage rules for platforms, which would encourage them or require them to take on all content from all comers, versus regimes of platform responsibility, which would say to the platforms, you need to be very careful that you don't spread, for example, misinformation about health, misinformation about elections, hate speech, right? Because on the one hand, you have a push toward in a very inclusive platform, and a platform that's almost like a dumb pipe that almost aspires to the condition of basic communications infrastructure. And on the other hand, you have a sense of their editorial role, this idea that they are providing content and that they need to be responsible for their content. So I want to try to help resolve that tension today, building on a couple of interventions that I made over the past few years. One, an article called Platform Neutrality, another called The Automated Public Sphere, and then open it up to a broader discussion about where we might go from here. So the first step I wanted to talk about is to defend some of the early common carriage regulations or proposals, because I think it's really important to note that this is about democratizing the economic aspects of the internet. And it may seem like, well, why should we talk about the economy, given that we're talking about politics and participation? But I'm really inspired by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson and her book, Private Government, where she talks about how important it is that the realms of private experience and commerce that we experience every day are often far more important to us and far more phenomenologically immediate than, say, an election that happens every 2 years, or even the sort of micro participation that we might have in other forms of civil society activity. And so therefore, I think it's really important that we have this possibility for the public to challenge, say, platforms that are not taking on, that are either discriminating against certain businesses in order to consolidate their control over certain business areas. These are classically competition law concerns or antitrust concerns, but there are also concerns about the degree to which the economy will be decentralized and be subject to some form of distributed control, as opposed to having increasing concentration of control in very large technology firms. So I think that that's an aspect of platform regulation. It is encouraging to see in, say, proposals by Elizabeth Warren and some of the recent competition law interventions that or bills that were just dropped in the US House of Representatives. And Europe has certainly led the way in many respects here with respect to its own very forward-thinking competition law interventions, and other acts are being proposed now. And so the idea here, I think, is that if we can bring in a more distributed expertise, that also is a blow for democratization, right? If we live in a world where we just feel like, well, there are these large companies and they tend to structure the way that we experience the internet via either our searches or our social media feeds, that really is an outsourcing of responsibility to sort of a private company. And that leads to something that I once described at in a talk in Berlin as a move from territorial to functional sovereignty by firms, versus the regulatory impact of requiring certain forms of participation and separating, say, platforms from commercial control over various areas. That involves distributed expertise and democratization. So, and finally, I just have to comment on the elevation of Lina Khan to the chair of the Federal Trade Commission in the US, I think is extremely heartening in this area, because she is someone who has brought in the concerns of democratic theory in areas that were often considered to be only economic, and only economic in the most technical sense. However, and so that sort of is my take on why platform regulation is a democratizing tool. But I also think we have to notice and acknowledge a recent turn in the advocacy of those who want to abuse platforms. And so we've had many rules and regulations with respect to platform responsibility over the past several years, in trying to stop false health information, to stop hate speech, to stop false claims about elections. And in response to those regulations, and either response to regulations by the state or by initiatives taken by platforms themselves, you sometimes get the response from those who want to spread misinformation that these platforms should be like public utilities, just as the phone company doesn't listen into people's phone calls to stop them from lying about others or from even plotting crimes, right? We should not have the platforms stepping in to do that. And there was actually a proposal in Ohio recently to declare Google a public utility. And this is something that, is the political valence of these types of claims has been completely reversed. If you go back to the classic work in the First Amendment law and free expression law of Barron, and from 1967 in terms of talking about the red line decision in the US and the right of the audience, that was often seen as a very progressive left proposal, and now it's been sort of turned on its head and is often being seized upon by the right. So the question finally comes, is there a way to reconcile rules requiring, regulating platforms, requiring some basic common carriage for businesses and for news media organizations that they may not want to carry? Can those be reconciled with forms of platform responsibility? There's two routes for doing that. One would be to say that, well, simply the platform is a private actor and that therefore it can do whatever it wants in the editorial realm, and to try to strictly distinguish between editorial and commercial concerns. Another approach would be to say that the types of things now imposed by platforms are taken upon themselves to stopping false health information, hate speech, and false claims about elections, that those things are things that the state itself could do. Right. And we have very variegated free expression law across the world. In some places, the state could indeed make those interventions, in other places they could not. But where I think I'll leave it in terms of my intervention is that it will be very important as we further develop platform regulation and common carriage type rules, and as we see further forms of platform responsibility and editorial responsibility imposed, that we develop clearer theories of reconciliation here. Either reconciliation by positing a strict divide between the public and the private and locating platforms in the private side, or by recognizing the essentially public character of platforms and strictly limiting their ability to stop certain forms of communication or expression to the same forms of communication and expression that the state itself could stop. So with that, thanks so much.
Brilliant, thank you, Frank. Lots of food for thought, and I'm so delighted that we have collectively set the stage for I'm sure, a great discussion to follow. I just want to pause here for a second and invite again our virtual participants to please share their questions. If they're addressed to a specific panelist, please state so. And in the meantime, I have two questions I would like to ask. One, more focusing again on some sort of the understanding of the transformations and the structural changes each of you have already started to unpack, and one more looking at the pathway forward, and again building upon some of your comments, what are strategies for change. So if I may start with the first one, again also in an attempt to get us in a conversation all together. It seems there are almost like two different possible views, and probably simultaneously they apply for what happens when we think about digitalization or digital transformation and democracy. One story, listening to what you described, is to say, well, actually what you're describing has a lot to do with what's happening in society more generally, and like institutional frameworks that are there, party dynamics, overall shifts in politics, as we're figuring out as societies what it means to live together and set the rules and so forth. So in some sense, it doesn't seem to be a story very much about digital technology. It's about society. So that's one account, right? And then on the other hand side, in your comments, I felt there were specific manifestations, what's really some sort of different about this digital moment of transformation. And I'm just mentioning maybe two examples, right? I think what has also come out already is, well, maybe the digital piece in all of this has to do how we think about the political and how we think about participation to begin with as a concept. So Andreas mentioned the tiny acts, right, as an example. But then there was also the notion, I think, Frank and Anat, you made this point too, maybe the digital also gives us new tools, how we shape the future that may be distinct from the analog offline age. And so I was just wondering whether this may be a good starting point for all of us again to clarify what's the digital in this story, and how do you think about it in these different contexts. And so whoever would like to go first, I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on how much is this a digital story versus a larger societal story. Who would like to jump in?
I can, if you would.
Please, yes.
I had one basic comment on this. I think it is a very help not to position technology against society, but really to understand technology as as social or as part of society, because we always build up the sort of societies we live in by the help of different technologies. And now it's somehow a new kind of technologies, the digital technologies. And I think what's crucial about digital technologies, to explain this, we can very easily refer to what are the changes for our processes of communication. So if you look back also to legacy media, it was just a kind of mediation, of course, power-related, complex, whatever, but the different kinds of media of communication were for mediation. And what we have now is that when we use platforms and other kinds of digital media, they're not just media for mediation of communication. At the same moment of time, when we use it for this purpose, they're also means of data collection. So something is happening in the background, increasingly in an automated way. And there is, from my perspective, really the crucial difference, because it increased the loops of recursivity we are all confronted with. So of course, human life has always been recursive, but now when we do something online, it is inscribed already via platforms in data, and somehow we are confronted with that again in feedback loops. So when we buy a book online, we get recommendation. When we like something on Facebook, it makes something with our timeline, and so on and so on. And I think exactly here the problem starts, that parts of the things which are going on are not only invisible, but in addition, only very few people know about how this process is structured. So it's beyond what we in former times understood democratic control. But on the other hand, this increased loops of recursivity could also be used for something different. And this is where I would see the chance. Of course, we must think for that about a different kind of digital infrastructure. So I often use, or I like to use the metaphor, imagine if something like the internet would have been possible in the 60s. In Europe, nobody would have spent one moment of time that it is owned by private companies. Everybody would say, oh, it's something so important. It must be something like public media. And I think the challenge we have now is that the technological spread of the internet came in the moment of time when we were used to the fact that everything in the realm of media was handled by private companies. And I think this is exactly the moment where the space to think about is much more open. It's not just about regulating private companies, but maybe it's also about freeing the public service media to offer them the chance to develop further for digital platforms. So this is, at least in Europe, a problem. They cannot do what they could do because of legal limitations. So maybe we should not only think about regulating platforms, we also should think about opening up the space for public service media to become something like public platforms.
That's great. Thank you, Andreas. And Anat, I know in your work, you've also embraced some sort of the power of digital technologies to create some sort of a new awareness of new political literacies of sorts. So very much embracing some of the techniques Andreas mentioned. I was wondering whether you can share a little bit from your work in the lab, where you see at least possibilities for change.
Yeah, thank you. I think while we're talking a lot about how digitization changes democracy, we often neglect thinking about how democracy itself is also an evolving structure. And I think perhaps we're not dedicating enough thought to perhaps rethinking democratic theory or democratic notions in light of these or mutual changes between democracy and technology. One of the things that I'm trying to do with digital tools is to try to set a different sphere, or try to show alternative epistemologies that would have been enabled or would have created other public spheres had digital platforms had the interest, or had they embedded more democratic values in their design of their algorithms or affordances. One of them was an attempt to build a search engine on top of Facebook, while it was still possible to extract data from Facebook using automated methods. So what I try to do is actually to build a different political public sphere from Facebook data of politicians, and create a parliament on Facebook, build a search engine on top of it, and then look at new ways of understanding political conversation from above, from understanding the entire political conversation, not just algorithmically or personally, in terms of what kind of knowledge one can learn on politics from social media. If one is using social media and interested in politics, they would have to scroll forever on so many pages of different politicians and never have a full overview of the entire political conversation in comparative terms. If I am an informed citizen, I would like to see the issue commitment of each politician to several issues that I care about before an election. And this is not something that I can do with the current interfaces of social media. So the idea was to invent options for imaginary scenarios had social media tried to make knowledge and political conversation more democratic. So this is just one example. There are others, but I'll leave it at that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. What a compelling story that demonstrates again also what bottom-up innovations and uses of technology can actually do to create or imagine at least alternative futures. So if I may, to turn from my first question to the second one, which is, and you built the bridge, Anat, and zoom in on one other tool in the toolkit, which is law and regulation, something that all of you have already emphasized. And Frank, maybe you can help me out here. The story is kind of a little confusing if we think about law and regulation, because again, it seems to be a state where we both have too much law and too little law in some ways, or the way these laws are used may or may not get us to this alternative, better future. So to give an example, you mentioned the First Amendment, among other things, and sometimes an aggressive interpretation of First Amendment, definitely in the US, may actually be a barrier to the types of reforms that you were talking about and that the others have made. On the other hand side, Anat and Andreas as well have mentioned the role of data protection in other parts of the world, where suddenly a very, laws that have been warmly welcomed and are tremendously important may also create new barriers as unintended consequences almost as we think about more participatory futures. And Andreas used one of examples of how we could share data in novel ways to work towards more decentralized architectures and the like for participation. So I'm wondering, this puzzle, Frank, like, how do we think about the function of law and the role of law as we are working through some of these problems? And maybe slightly more specifically, and this also links to a question from the Q&A, it seems to be another fundamental problem with law and regulation, and that is, it is still very domestic, right? And yet, at least many of the platforms we were talking about and the technologies we're talking about and the data flows that are happening in the background, to use Andreas' words, are global, are cross-border. And so what's the power of law in all of this, and how much is it a help or is it an expression of the problem? Can you share some perspectives? I know it's a big question, but maybe just to give us a sense.
Yes. No, it's a fantastic question, and I think that it is really important for us to deeply consider something I would call three-dimensional chess, right? I mean, when I teach administrative law, what I often emphasize is that we begin law school looking at conflicts between two persons, a plaintiff and a defendant. And then later, when we come up to administrative law, we run into these entities, agencies, administrative bodies that are trying to interpret statutes put together by a legislature, and sometimes making rules, sometimes making directives, sometimes adjudicating them directly. And then there's a dialogue, in a sense, between those agencies and courts. And so we have this level of complexity that is, sometimes head-swimmingly confusing, because there are so many interests at play, and there's so many considerations to feed in. I think one way, though, that I would really try to address this problem is to say that what I often hear in terms of the internationalization of social media and of other large communicatively inflected tech platforms is that if you allow local control, that is just going to give away the game to authoritarian regimes that are going to have ever more power to manipulate the information flows to their own constituencies. And so therefore, a broadly libertarian approach, sort of saying that the platforms are outside the context of law or outside the context of national law, that there has to be some international rules on them, is a broadly emancipatory stance, right? But I really would contest that. I mean, I contest that because I feel as though the problem is that the ability or lack of ability of, say, any particularly well-ordered polity to contrast, say, with an authoritarian polity, that ability of that polity to regulate or not regulate within its own boundaries is really not something that's going to, I think, either positively or negatively impact the ability of the authoritarian state to do so. The authoritarian states are going to do that anyway. And so therefore, I think that I would be more of a maximalist in terms of saying that for those of us who believe that we are in well-ordered and democratic polities, and that these polities have something to say about the structure of online life, that we should push forward with the forms of regulation that we think are going to be having a positive impact on the public sphere, on democratization, and on persons generally, without undue concern that that's going to just create some sort of precedent for others, because with the precedent or without it, I think those other states are going to go in that direction. Of course, that raises the interesting question of what is a well-ordered polity and what is not, right? And that, I think, is where this gets to your first question, I think, Urs, which is to say, to what extent are we talking about digital technologies, and to what extent are we really in the midst of ongoing societal transformations? And that's one reason why, on the end of the Automated Public Sphere article, I tried to give a very rough political theory guide as to how we might inform ourselves about this decision. Of course, it's always a contextual judgment. There's no theory that can provide it. But I think that to the extent that you have a polity that broadly there's societal consensus that all members of the political community are welcome, and that all forms of expression that are respecting democracy deserve some hearing, that feeds into a deliberative democratic model, the type of political theory that we see in, say, Jane Mansbridge, or the ideal theory there. Dare I say, even Habermas and others, sort of, and to the extent that we have something like that type of polity existing, then I think we should be more comfortable with the role of domestic regulation in setting these rules. And of course, in mandating and helping develop the technology that would enable that type of domestic regulation. But to the extent that we see a more Schmittian model of politics arising, if you have very large portions of society that essentially adopt the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction as the core of their political identity, and see large segments of the society as essentially never deserving of sharing in power, to that extent, then I would not be able to endorse domestic regulation in such societies. And so, of course, this sort of is a contextual judgment. It has to be made with respect to any one particular political situation. But I think that this type of spectrum at least helps guide us with respect to the degree to which we think it's legitimate for states to assert and to further, say, fragment the internet to the extent that this leads to fragmentation or what Julie Cohen would call semantic discontinuity between nodes of the network. That is one spectrum that could help us, I think, say, assess the legitimacy of those sorts of interventions.
Thank you, Frank. Very, very helpful frameworks, and I appreciate also your earlier call for more theory, and I think that's a key to guide our thinking and our actions in the future. So I appreciate your comments. We have a few questions from the audience, and they're slightly more specific than the conversation we just had, but very important. So if I may start with two questions that touch upon the participation theme that you introduced in your initial comments. And so the first question, Anat, and I think it was also highlighted already in Andreas's comments, is about participation gaps. And the question from the audience refers to the fact that Israel is a very digital society, yet that may come with the problem that the older generation, elderly people, may have problems to use the internet and digital tools to participate in not only the digital economy, but also in the digital democracy. And so I was wondering, where do you see some sort of efforts going, and what should we do about these sorts of participation gaps within a society?
Yes, I guess participation gaps exist also among different population groups, so not just the elderly, but also ethnic minorities, and also members of the Jewish Orthodox population who well, internet penetration rates or use with these populations is very low. Here I return to the idea of digital literacy and education, and not, again, not in paternalistic terms of teaching people on how to participate, but rather on the importance of participation and opening up opportunities for critical consumption of media or critical understanding of media and data in our contemporary media environments. This could perhaps help elderly people, for example, or other people from disadvantaged communities to first understand the media ecology we live in, even before they participate in these ecologies.
Thank you, Anat. I was wondering, Andreas, whether you want to jump in as well, because you've done a lot of research also on this question of participation gaps, and it's, I believe, also highlighted in the report that you worked on. How do we close some of the participation gaps Anat mentioned, whether it's populations of different socioeconomic background or varying educational levels or different generational differences? How do we think about these issues?
Well, on the first level, I absolutely agree. I think when it comes to this level of participation, not only individual, but also within groups, the point where you can best start with is supporting all forms of media literacy. But on the other side, I think the point is that we also must somehow cautious about in seeing the complexity of these divides. Just when I come back to the original question, when it comes to age, we cannot say anymore that all elderly problems have problems with the digital. So people who are now in the 70s, in the 80s, were partly pioneers of technological development. So they are highly skilled and much more skilled than the younger people. And on the other hand, if you look at the younger people, well, on the one hand, parts of them can use their mobile phone, of course, very well when it comes to social media, but they have deficits in many, many other areas. For example, in searching for particular kinds of information and so on and so on. So what I think when it comes to these questions of digital gap, we really must address them in the complexity. And then it's more a matrix of, on the one hand, having a look at the different age groups, but on the other hand, also of having a look on the other kinds of criteria which makes it different. So, for example, if people have a migration background, what the education background is, what the financial resources are, and so on and so on. And having such a more complex perspective, I think we have a starting point of addressing problems of media literacy, because we begin to, or we are able to develop projects to support people on a more specific way than many projects have been before, which were just the broad things saying, well, it is a question of age, or it is a question of income, or whatever. So I think this is the point where we might start with.
Great. Frank, do you want to weigh in?
Well, no, I'm fine. We can take other questions. That's fine.
Okay, so there's one, and I'm cognizant of time. There's one question, maybe, Frank, where you could some sort of share a perspective about the emerging role of the state as slowing down or impeding digital acceleration. I'm not sure I totally get the question. Where do the boundaries lie between anti-merger regulation and regime pressure a la Russia, China, and India? But I guess it comes to the different roles states can play as we go through this digital transformation. So I was wondering whether I can share this question with you.
Sure. I mean, I particularly will seize on the idea of slowing down, because I think that this is a fascinating area in the sociology of temporality. If you look at the work of Judy Wachman or Hartmut Rosa, it's really interesting to think about how platforms either speed up or slow down our consumption of news. There was recently a piece published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Carl Bangstrom and many co-authors, sort of really marking out how profound the shift has been in terms of the organization of information flows, and part of that is the speed. And I think that part of wisdom here, in following the work of Sophia Noble, a really interesting media theorist in UCLA, is to embrace the opportunities for slowness, embrace opportunities to take a second look at what type of information flows are happening, how fast material can be shared, putting in a little bit of a circuit breaker, the same we see in the stock markets. If the stock market crashes by 1,000 points, there's a little circuit breaker that stops trading. I think there's some interesting issues there. And there was a whole book actually by Frank Partnoy called Wait, and then Jason Farman has another book called Delayed Response, sort of praising this idea of slowing down things slightly in order to provide more opportunity for reflection and for human input in what can be, I think, inhumanly fast automated systems. And so I think that's one potential path of wisdom here, and where I would maybe question the valence of the negativity of slowing down. With respect to state interventions, Russia, China, India, I think many of these are deeply troubling, and I think that we have to, and I think the question becomes then, how can there be ongoing provision of opportunities for, say, either circumvention or for other forms of resistance to some of the worst of those interventions. And I think that's something that will be a long-term question, to be considered by those who want to promote more freedom and democracy around the world. So thanks.
Thank you, Frank. We have 1 minute left, so it's time to wrap up. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to go through every single question in the Q&A. Obviously, this is just the beginning of an ongoing conversation. Maybe as a closing, if we could go around our virtual table here and just a tweet length statement from each of you, one reason why you are either optimistic or pessimistic about the future of democracy in the digital age, And I would like to start with Frank, then Andreas, and then Anat, please.
I am optimistic about the potential for democratization of many spheres outside of politics, including economics and culture. But I have to admit that I am a bit pessimistic about the capacity of existing democratic institutions to respond resiliently to new forms of media.
Okay, good. I'm also optimistic because criticism got a broader, or the critical discussion about platform started over the last years on a very deep and sophisticated level. So this was not expected, or I could not expect this the 5 or 10 years before. And so in the end, I think this will support the chances we have in this digital world. And I expect there is a positive future.
I'm truly pessimistic, so I'm sorry to be the last to make the statement. I'm very concerned about the future of democracy with the current trends, with digitization and the incorporation of the corporate logic as the imperative of progress. If there would be a way to detach the principles of surveillance capitalism from the political system, then that would be one positive trend towards the future. But in the meantime, the atomization of society through algorithms and through data injustice is too concerning to be optimistic about the future. Sorry about the...
Well, I think between optimism and pessimism is realism, and I feel altogether we're pretty realistic about the current play and the future opportunities. So thank you, dear panelists. Thank you, dear participants in the conversation. We hope to see you later today for the 4th and concluding session of this series. Where to go from here will be the topic, which puts me and all of us in the lucky position that we don't have to offer a summary of our rich conversation today. And with that, many thanks. Be well, be safe. See you soon. Bye.